Japanese gardens are an internationally recognized treasure, reflective of over 1,400 years of craftsmanship and refinement. On September 11th, the Japan Society of Northern California held an online seminar discussing these gardens in detail. During the program, Steve Beimel, founder of JapanCraft21, dove into the techniques used in some of Kyoto's finest gardens. Moderation was provided by Steve Pollock, president of the Japan Society of Northern California.
Thank you guys for joining us. I'm going to get started. So my name is Dewan Mercado, and I am the program coordinator here at the Japan Society. For the people who are new or haven't joined us in a long time, the Japan Society is the second oldest Japan Society created. We were created in 1905, and it's our mission to connect the Bay Area, Northern California to Japan. So the ways that we do that is by having events such as today, where we focus more on Japanese culture, Japanese nature, but we do have a variety of events that focus more on policy side, political side. We do hands-on activities. We've done Japanese archery in the past. We have symposiums focusing on space, AI. Later on this month, if you guys are in the Bay Area, we invite you to come to our gala. It's our biggest event of the year. You'll get to meet a lot of amazing people in the US-Japan network. We are honoring two amazing people. The first is from Sozo Ventures, Nakamura-san, and he has been on the Forbes list, one of the few Japanese people who've made the Midas touch. And for people who are more into pop culture, we'll be awarding Snoopy. So if you love Peanuts, the Charles Schwartz family has connections to the Bay Area. We'll have special appearances from many people you might recognize. So we encourage you to take a look on our site and join us for our gala. We also have Japanese language classes as well that just started. A lot of the classes have filled up now, but again, we still want people who are interested in potentially going to Japan to let us know. We have waiting lists, so you can check our language sites as well if you want to do that, or if there's spots that are still open, we encourage you to do that. Moving on to today's event, it's about understanding Japanese gardens. So, summertime, people want to go outside. And one of the things that I like to do is be in nature. I really love gardens. And the place that really helped me appreciate gardens was when I was studying abroad in Japan. I was at Sophia University. It's Tokyo, it's a huge megacity. And so sometimes that can be overwhelming. So I think that, the opportunities I had to go to different gardens helped me relax and helped me put myself at ease, but I never really understood why. And so that's why today we are inviting an expert or a super fan of Japanese gardening, Steve Beimel from JapanCraft21, to kind of tell us why is it that, we enjoy being around and looking at Japanese gardens and what makes them unique, maybe compared to a Western style or European style garden. JapanCraft21 is an amazing organization. They make it a mission to revitalize Japanese crafts. They go from ceramics all the way to paintings and vase making. I'll let Steve tell a little bit more about that in a second. But they also have a school in Kyoto where they're teaching people how to create traditional Japanese homes as well as garden making. And so we have been working with Steve for a while. This is our second event, and we want to have more events with Steve. So we learned from our last survey, there was an overwhelming amount of people who enjoyed the Japanese ceramics one. So if you went to that event, thank you very much. We appreciate that. And after this event, we want to work with them as well to potentially do an event focusing on Japanese mindfulness and architecture. So kind of how the way that things are built can change the way that you think and affect that. And so be on the lookout for that. And I will pass it on to Steve Beimel to tell you a little bit more about JapanCraft21, their mission into revitalizing Japanese arts, master crafts, and how he got into gardens and what they represent. So thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to go right into my slides. So as Duan had said, we are JapanCraft21, and our mission is to revitalize Japanese craftsmanship, master craftsmanship for the 21st century. If you look at the right side of the scale, it might represent the master crafts around the world. And when we speak of master crafts, we're saying crafts which are passed on from generation to generation, hundreds and sometimes even over 1,000 years. And if you could arguably say that if you put all of the crafts, master crafts in the world, which are still being made today on the right side, Japan might have more than most of them put together. So we're looking at the decline in Japanese master craftsmanship. If Japan is then the powerhouse of craftsmanship for the entire world, we look at 1979, there were 300,000 master craftsmen working in Japan. Fast forward to 2028, the estimate is there'll be 20,000 left. That's a 92% decrease in 40 some odd years. This is what caught our attention. This is what caused us, this motivated us to start JapanCraft21, a way to revitalize this, somehow to turn this around. We're a small organization and we were limited in what we could do, but we had to do something. And the result is an organization with a mission to identify problems, create strategies, and take actions. Very simple. We don't do a lot of seminars and symposiums, but we try and find the problems and get to work and put them into action. So understanding Japanese gardens, why did we choose Japanese gardens to speak about today? Well, one reason is there's so many crafts which are connected to the Japanese garden. Steel forged shears and garden tools, wood joinery, bamboo mud walls, all those wonderful stone monuments, lanterns, water basins. And those are the major points. There are so many, let's say, subcrafts which go into the creation of a Japanese garden. So it's a very important cultural phenomenon that by supporting Japanese gardens, we support Japanese crafts. So we're going to begin here at Tenryu-ji. It's an amazing garden built in the 1300s on the west side of Kyoto by the great garden master Muso Kokushi, one of the great garden masters of all time. But if you think about this, if you think about the gardens you've seen in Europe, Egyptian gardens from history, Roman gardens, which we see historically, and also most of the gardens that were built in the US up until the Japan influence of just a few years ago, those gardens were obviously designed by humans. They had a real human touch to them. But the Japanese somehow in history decided to create natural looking gardens that emulate nature. They're not man-made gardens. They're very, very different from what we have in the Western culture. And I wondered about this. Why would you build a garden like this next to a mountain scene, which is pretty much the same thing? And over time, the concept came very clear to me is that the Japanese are not trying to create a man-made garden. They're trying to create a glimpse of perfection, a glimpse of paradise, an ideal. So a Japanese garden is actually more perfect than nature. If you go into nature, there are weeds and things are not trimmed, and there are dead branches, et cetera, but the Japanese garden is an attempt at perfection. So today we're going to look at the historical and cultural background of Japanese gardens, the types of Japanese gardens, basic elements, concepts, and we'll come back to Tenryu-ji because Tenryu-ji seems to encompass most of the things we're talking about. And we begin with the word for garden in Japanese. It's made up of two kanji characters. One would be te, which encompasses or embodies the wildness of nature, the fury, the wildness, the raw majesty of nature. And then we have the term en, which is mankind's participation. So there's a pastoral element, fences, walls. You can see there's a wall around this character. It's cultivating plants, fruit trees, stepping stones, bridges, basins. And when you put them together, it creates teien, which is the concept of the wildness of nature plus the participation of man or humans. The original Japanese gardens and the original Shinto shrines were basically divine space, gravel and sand, or a water element where people would come and they would commune. They would see this, come to this. They wouldn't step inside, but this is where Shinto gods were existing, were an abode, so to speak. And you would see the same thing with water elements as you still do today, or a sacred stone, a sacred tree. But if you go across the Sea of Japan to China, China was a Taoist country from about 2,500 years ago. And in Taoism is a quest for immortality. And in Taoism, there was a belief that there were islands of paradise off the east coast of China, born on the backs of huge sea turtles. And these islands were absolutely exquisite. There were ponds and waterfalls and exquisite birds and beautiful flowers and trees. And it was believed that the immortal beings would fly back and forth from the Chinese mainland to these islands. And it's not unlike the Western concept of El Dorado, where we are seeking the eternal life in El Dorado. So 2,000 years ago, the Chinese were still looking for these islands. They couldn't find them. And the emperor at that time in the Han Dynasty decided, if we can't find those islands in our expeditions out there in the sea, let's build in our own compounds exquisite little scenes of nature. So we bring the immortal beings to us. And that was the beginning of the Chinese garden. The Japanese visited China quite often during the 500s and 600s, and they saw these gardens. They brought the concept back to Japan. They mixed it, they combined it with the sense of divine space from the Shinto aspect, and it became a hybrid, the Japanese garden. Originally, in the beginning, Japanese gardens were highly influenced by Chinese topography, which is very different from Japanese. But over time, they began to look to their own landscape for inspiration. And these are the landscapes which inspire Japanese gardens for most of history. There are many types of gardens, and we're going to begin with the scroll garden. A scroll garden is a garden seen from within a building, and ideally about 6 feet, 2 meters back from the veranda. So you have the benefit of the posts, which are a framing device. The idea is that you see everything at one glance. It's called 10,000 trees at one glance, and nothing is hidden. And in a way that could be seen as a kind of divine space, because people are not allowed to walk in there. It's just seen from the house or the building. A strolling garden is very different. It's a series of environments which are connected by stepping stones or paths like this. And the concept here is hide and reveal. So as you walk through a space, you'll notice something, and then you walk a little bit farther and you don't see it anymore, but you see something else. So things are shown to you. And these are what I would call points of engagement. Every time you see something interesting, you remember that it, on some level of your consciousness, it may be subconscious, but it kind of wakes you up and it brings forth a sense of mindfulness. So these gardens are different every hour during the day and every day of the year. So there's always a constant refreshing feeling of discovery going through these gardens. It never gets old. A paradise garden, very close to Buddhism, would be a garden which gives us a kinesthetic sense of what the other side is like, where, let's say, nirvana or paradise. Dry gardens became popular after about the late 1400s. And we're careful not to use the term Zen garden. The term Zen garden is not in Japanese, actually. It was coined by an American journalist about 70 years ago. So we use the word dry garden or dry mountains and water. And they're very, they allow us to have a garden where there's no water source, which is very convenient. But gravel usually, if not always, denotes water in movement in some way. Now, these gardens were inspired by ink paintings from the Southern Song Dynasty in China in the 1200s, and then again in the 1400s when the Japanese took up this art form. And so in a sense, we're looking at a three-dimensional ink painting. The tea garden became very popular after the late 1500s with the great tea master, Sen no Rikyu. And a tea garden is different from the previous gardens. There are no great views. There's nothing to wow you, very few flowering plants. It's mostly mossy. It's contemplative. It's designed to bring you inward instead of outward. The pocket garden is an urban garden for urban houses, allowing the owners to have a little bit of a garden where there's not a lot of room available. So of all the basic elements of the Japanese garden that we see here, we're going to begin with streams. If you look at the stream, even though in the photo here, the stream extends all the way to the top of the photo, you can only see part of the stream. Now, streams are wonderful because they give us movement, they give us sound. They're evocative when you walk through it. Our attention goes to there for points of engagement. But there's a technique, or there's a concept in Japanese called yugen, an aesthetic concept where, for example, if you're looking at a mountain and you can only see part of the mountain because of the fog and the clouds, in your imagination, you will actively create the things you cannot see. And this is a way that we become engaged with the garden in a way that we probably wouldn't if we could see the entire thing clearly. It's an important aesthetic concept seen all throughout Japan in arts and design. So in this garden, we can't see from any one place, we can't see the whole thing, the whole stream, but as we walk along, we will see different parts of it. Again, hide and reveal. Waterfalls are very important. They give us sound, they give us movement, they create an atmosphere with mist. On the left side, you can see a large waterfall, and you see that you can see the nature or the quality of the water flowing down. It's referred to as silk cloth rolling over a table. Whereas down below, you have the waterfall is broken up into what would be called skeins of yarn. It's very different. So they're very different kinds of waterfalls, and they're all determined by the all-important lip stone at the top. Now, if you look at this picture, you'll see on the right side, there's another very different element, quite a juxtaposition. You have waterfall on one side, you have stairs on the other side, and this is one of those points of engagement where we see this, and at some point we say, oh, and we become mindful, and it's one of those things that you'll see so often in a Japanese garden or in architectural sites. That kind of juxtaposition. Here we have the skein of yarn, and the rock at the bottom is what is called the water breaking stone. It breaks up the water, it creates sound, it creates mist, creates a cool feeling, at least visually. A dry waterfall. The dry waterfall is constructed as if water was really going to flow down it. So there's a great deal of integrity in building a dry waterfall. You're not just slapping stones together. They're built to work with water or without. So this is an island in the middle of a pond. Islands are very important. Now think of this. If you've ever moved out of a house, and the house, which had been filled with furniture, suddenly was empty. Didn't that house seem small? Didn't those rooms seem really small in comparison? The same thing happens when you place an island in a pond. The pond seems much larger than it really is. And so what we can't see, we tend to, in our imagination, create larger and more grand. Rock placement is probably the most important part of a garden. It creates the structure, the skeleton of the garden. Stones are placed up to 40–50% of their size is buried under the ground. So no matter what kind of river overflow or earthquake, those stones are pretty much permanent. And the stones are chosen for their color, their texture, their shapes. And so even though these stones may have come from many, many different places, they're combined together because they have similar qualities. And the great masters of Japanese garden building are the ones entrusted in placing the stones. It's an intuitive process based on many years of experience. In gardens, we will often see tea houses, and they act as pavilions. We're familiar with the Chinese garden pavilion, which is a kind of an ornate building. In Japan, they place tea houses in gardens, and they're usually very rustic looking buildings. Tea houses by nature is refined rusticity in Japan. And when we look at this, we look at this rustic building, it takes us off someplace to a very remote place. It's a way of we can feel rejuvenated by being far away from the city. When Katsurariki was built, there were already hundreds of thousands of people living in Kyoto. So this was a kind of retreat where people could escape that. Again, using Yugen, the tea houses are partially hidden by foliage, allowing us to see that in our creative imagination in a greater way. Bridges are a very important part of pond and river construction. The best place to view a garden bridge is from its side. And when you see the bridge, the far bridge there, the first thing that comes to many of our minds is what's on the other side there. I can't see it. It must be interesting. There's a mystery about that. It's evocative, and so we're drawn to that. So viewing the bridge from its side is how they are normally set up. Stepping stones are a method of bringing us through various environments. And they could be cut stones like this. Cut stones are closer to an urban environment, or they could be natural stones. But if you just notice this, look at how seemingly spontaneously these stones are placed here. There's this randomness, this playfulness. I mean, was built in the early 1600s. This kind of 20th century spontaneity that we like to think as Western has deep roots in Japanese design. So these would be more natural stones. Again, cut stones, more of an urban feel. Oftentimes stones which were foundation stones of buildings which previously existed that were torn down are placed in a garden as a kind of historic preservation or continuity. So these are foundation stones from a building in a pond. Gates tell us a lot about the site. Now, one would think, maybe in a Western way of thinking, that the most important imperial villa in a country would have a gate that would have stone lions in front of it and be very, very ornate. But in this case, in Japan, more often than not, the more elite the site, the more rustic it appears. So this would be the gate to the imperial villa. Very much influenced by the tea aesthetic of Sen-no-rikyu. Fences are used very frequently in gardens as outer perimeters or as ways of guiding us through areas. And this natural type of fencing became popular with the tea era of the late 1500s and has been with us ever since. And these fences are a great craft tradition. Master gardeners build these fences, and there's so many different varieties. And Japanese are wonderful masons, so we have wonderful walls in our gardens here. Here's a mud wall into which roof tiles were pressed, an interesting motif texture. Now, if you look here at this paint, when I say painting, it's like a painting in that if you think about Asian paintings, Chinese, Korean, Japanese paintings, landscape paintings, there's always a little tiny man or woman walking up a hill, someone on a boat, a fisherman, a little hut. Those are referred to as human elements. And when you look at those, you can see yourself in the painting. It's like an invitation or a permission for you to enter the painting. Without those human elements in the painting, it takes much more work to imagine yourself in the painting. The same thing is true with gardens. You'll see in a scroll garden such as this, where we're not allowed to walk, you'll see a bridge, you'll see a basin, you may see a water well. And just by looking at this, we will start to imagine ourselves, for example, on this boat stone, riding the boat stone down the gravel river. Or with these stone lanterns. There are 250 styles of stone lanterns in Japan. And this is just one style of many. And they can be lit at night with candles, creating magical environments. Posts support the roof. This is a really important concept in Japan. You know, we think of the floor-to-ceiling window as a 20th century Western architectural element, but this has been going on in Japan for hundreds and hundreds of years. The outer walls do not support the roof, so they could be removed and replaced with just sliding doors. And this creates a mindset with people. So if you don't have walls, your garden becomes part of the house. If you're looking at a garden through a tiny window, as we were doing traditionally for hundreds and hundreds of years, it's a very different mindset. So having the roof supported by posts, allowing the garden to come into the house is a very interesting concept, which has affected the entire world. And the Japanese engawa veranda, when you look at the building, you see the veranda and think it's part of the building, but when you're inside looking out, that veranda becomes part of the garden, or at least a bridge to that garden, making it more accessible in your imagination, a stepping stone. Dimensions are very important, and it can intensify or actually weaken the effect. Now, if you're on the left side here, you're sitting on the veranda and you have a square garden, I will venture to say that that garden would be much more powerful, much more intense if you would bring the backdrop much closer to the veranda and create a rectangle. And so this is pretty much standard for scroll gardens. They're very wide, but they're not very deep. And they have the intensity that we just described. Now, if you're looking at this particular restaurant in Tokyo, the same concept, floor-to-ceiling windows, very wide garden, but not very deep. And it's the same effect. It's the same brilliant concept. Framing is, again, one of the most important parts of Japanese architecture, garden design. And you see it all through traditional China as well, having such a strong influence from China. So we see how framing has been adopted and amplified and expanded. So if a human being can see 180 degrees, our normal vision is 180 degrees. If you could take that 180 degrees and you could compress it into 60 degrees, as if you're looking through a camera lens, that picture becomes much more alive, much more powerful. So if you're sitting on the veranda and then you come inside and see this intensified version, this is a beautiful example of less is more. We have less view, but it's much more intense, creating these great points of engagement. Transitions. Transitions greatly expand our sense of time. And I'll explain that. The more points of engagement we can experience from point A to point B as we're walking, the farther we'll feel like we've walked and the longer it will seem that we've walked. So points of engagement are ways that bring us mindful. And so if I'm going to point out the points of engagement, just a few of them as we walk through this site. We begin in a fairly nondescript formal area, and then we turn the corner, and immediately the stepping stones are different. There's this long, narrow corridor, so we're going from wide to very narrow. We're going from shady to a dappled light. These are points of engagement. We see something new. We see trees that are trimmed in a very unusual way. It starts with large tree, gets small and then smaller. We turn, it's a point of engagement, it's an experience. We go from wide to narrow as we go, we go from narrow to wide as we go from this walkway up a step, from light to dark, through the gate. We see something new. We turn, there's a long corridor which is somewhat undetailed. There aren't a lot of details, so there's a minor sense of monotony as we walk down here, making us feel like we're walking farther. We see something new here. We turn, we see something new again. We go from a very shady area to a dappled area. Again, we go up a step into a darker gate. We see something new, we see it closer. We turn, we see something new, we see it closer. And then we're at our destination in the informal garden. So we start at formal, we go through semi-formal, and then we end up in informal. And if I were to ask you the next day, if we didn't analyze this together as we're doing now, if I asked you the next day how far or how long it took you to go from A to B, you might say 10 minutes or 15 minutes. It only took a minute or a minute and a half to walk that. So I counted 30 points of engagement here, and there are probably many more because each person will be engaged by things, different things. It's a very individual thing in addition to the ones that I mentioned. So in a scroll garden, there's a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. And this is pretty amazing when you think of this concept, 400 years old. If you're looking at a garden and there are details in the distance, if there are details right at your feet, there are details in the middle ground, your eyes are going back and forth, focusing, refocusing, and it's very tiring. So they came up with this concept in a scroll garden that you have a foreground, which is pretty nondescript, just gravel. You have a background, which is pretty nondescript, basically roof tiles, but you have this narrow band at this across the garden here, where all the garden elements are placed, and it minimizes the focusing of your eyes, and it gives you a very comfortable, intense experience. Scroll gardens, the backdrops help define the site. So at Tenryu-ji, the backdrop would be nature. And so this garden seems to be going on forever and ever. But at Ryoanji, we have a very clearly defined backdrop, which focuses our attention on the stone arrangement. This is a garden of meditation, whereas the previous one might be considered one of contemplation. So this is more intense. This is an interesting point I've found when you think of the ink paintings from the the Sung Dynasty, Southern Sung Dynasty, and in Japan. Monochromatic paintings of peaks of mountains bathed in fog and clouds. This type of backdrop is reminiscent of those paintings with the white walls. This particular garden is a fairly small garden, designed by the great tea master Kobori Enshu. You see that there, the garden itself does not extend back to this wooded area, because it's very easy to believe that it's all one garden, because the hedge here, which is the outer perimeter of the garden, is low and it's green. It's not a wall, so it's much easier for us to believe that the garden goes on forever and ever. And this garden would have a background. This would be in an urban setting, so the 3 layers of green to reinforce that and to screen out unwanted views. So there are vectors of sight which are naturally found in, well, I say naturally, they are placed in a Japanese garden to create certain effects. So if you look at this waterfall, it's 700 years old, but we would think that it's been there forever. And one of the reasons why we think it's been there so long is that if you look at the construction, the stones on the right side are moving from right to left in this direction, and right where my cursor is, they're meeting. It meets up about this point. The left side, the stones go from left to right, and they meet up here, and then the water goes down in this direction, forming a pyramid. And we know that the pyramid for the human consciousness is a very powerful symbol. When we look at this, we just assume this has been here forever. The same thing in this garden, you'll see wherever there's a monument stone, a vertical element, and then something is coming out of it like this to the left, our eyes will naturally go to the left. And so here we have these powerful pillars, and then our eyes go to the right and to the left. This is, again, creating the sense of solidity. These bridges in our mind, in our subconscious has been here forever. They're not just something that people made. We look at the silver pavilion, pine trees in the background, pine trees and cedars, they're pointing upward. So those are arrows going upward. We have the red pines in the middle ground, which are flat, and they take our vision from right to left. And then we have this runway in the middle that our eyes go directly into the garden. And so you have a cathedral effect, a grand effect through the vectors moving our eyes. Stone arrangements is a very big subject. We could speak the whole hour about stone arrangements. This is just one kind of typical pattern. You'll see a very large stone. It'll be a yang stone, the male energy in yin yang. You'll have the flat female yin stone, the earth mother, peace, solidity. And then you'll have the third stone, which is neither one or the other, but it's kind of in between. And you notice that this big stone and the flat stone together, they really set each other off. And the flat stone makes the big stone seem really big, and the big stone makes the flat stone seem really flat. You'll see this repeated over and over in Japan, in Japanese gardens. In this particular scene, this first stone would be referred to, technically it's called a master stone, but people tend to anthropomorphize stone relationships. So people will see, for example, these two as almost like they're bowing to this big stone. And then all these three are placed first, and then all the other stones are placed one at a time, all in relationship to this big stone, whether they're facing it or they're in opposition to it. Aesthetic pruning, another topic for an entire hour. I'm just going to speak about pines. Pines are one of the chosen trees for Japanese gardens. First of all, they can be trimmed beautifully, which allows us to look through the tree. It gives us a sense of transparency. We don't feel claustrophobic with a dark, fully grown tree. So there's a lot of open space. It allows us to see the beautiful structure of the tree, and it allows light to go to the bottom, to the floor of the garden, so plants will grow. So pines are very, very practical, and they also are used to, in this case, it spreads our vision from left to right with vectors. Another form of pruning would be to prune in a kind of geometric shape. So you have these round shapes or these cubes, but they're stepping stones going up the hill. Or placing several shrubs together and pruning them as one unit to form a kind of a mountain chain. Now, the Japanese are masters at expanding space through illusion. And one of them is borrowed scenery. So of course we see the mountain here is an extension of our garden. It goes on forever and ever, as using the low hedge again allows us to see the mountain in the background as part of the garden scene. But on the other hand, if you want to screen out buildings, if you want a more sense of intimacy in the garden, you could place trees there to block the view. Transparency and layering, a way of taking a relatively small space and making it seem really big. So consider that you're standing outside, you're looking through the window of this building. It's a small building, and you're looking at the tree. But between you and the tree, there's a layer, one layer of tatami, another layer. There's a portal through this door. There's another layer of tatami, another layer of tatami, another one, another portal, a veranda, plants, and then the tree. So between you and the tree, there are all these layers, which makes it seem really far away. There's a lot of detail in between. And if there was only you and the tree, it would just be a little tree over there. But this way, it seems there's a sense of ampleness, expansiveness, to be able to take a small place and make it seem really comfortable and big. Same thing here. The water, the stones are all, each one is a layer, and our vision is directed towards this mystical, magical place on the other side of the last bridge. And because of all the layers, it seems far away. You notice how everything in this picture, all the trees, everything seems to be pointing to us to this climactic finish. Now, if you look at this, we're looking at this stream. Imagine you're sitting on a stone bench under a wisteria trellis, and there's a pond in front of you. On the other side of the pond, there is this stream, and it's not a very big area, but by using certain techniques through layering, it makes it seem much larger. For example, there are 3 waterfalls, so that you get that depth of perception. Also, you would think that the sides of the stream would be parallel, but they're not. They purposely made it a triangle. We can't tell this, we can't see this, but it's an actual triangle which is forced perspective. Then the zigzag in the stream makes it seem farther away. The stream itself widens and narrows, another way of expanding our sense of distance. And finally, the choice of stones is really amazing. You would expect that all the stones were the same size, but actually, stone A and B are very large, but stone C and D are purposely really small. And so when you look at it in your subconscious, you assume it's small because it's so far away. By placing the bridge very low, it makes the garden look farther away, makes this waterfall behind look farther away, but also very big as well. So normally we would see trees like this and we assume that they're fully grown trees, but they've actually placed miniature trees here. So when we look at the gold pavilion, we don't think of them as miniature. We just assume in our subconscious that they're fully grown, they're normal height. And this makes the gold pavilion look very far away, but actually very grand and magnificent. So we are back to Tenryu-ji. And so Tenryu-ji, we have the borrowed scenery. We have the natural backdrop as it melts into the mountains. We have trimming that's done carefully close by, but the trimming gets less and less the farther you go into the garden, so it blends into the mountains. You have the dimensions. It's very wide, but not very deep in dimensions. You have the reference to sacred space with the raked sand here in front. You have the foreground, middle ground, and background. You have manipulation of stone size, whereas these stones here are of a certain size. You would expect the stones back there to be the same size, but many of them are smaller. So it gives you that illusion of being farther away. You have a varied shoreline. The shoreline is varied. You have an undulating shoreline. And you have, in the next slide, we see, oh, yes. So you have if the garden pond were this shape, it would seem very small. But because it's this shape, we have islands and peninsulas, and you have this undulating shoreline, it seems much bigger than it is. You have, as I mentioned, you have this varied shoreline. You have stones in some place, you have grasses in some place, and this adds to the sense of size. Also, finally, you have these pink arrows. The water is flowing around the islands, around the peninsulas. We have no idea where it's going, but in our imagination, we assume it's going on forever and ever. And so we have the framing. When we take this 180-degree view and we break it down into 60 degrees, we see that the dry waterfall is back there. We see the human element with the bridge. And we see framing every area throughout this complex. You'll look through the framing and see a different view, and each one is perfect in itself. So we looked at the history, we looked at types of Japanese gardens, basic elements, concepts, and we came back to Tenryu-ji. And we are JapanCraft21, and our main focus is to revitalize crafts for the 21st century. So we have a big job ahead of us, as I explained earlier, and we are taking action we're trying to be as practical and efficient as we can. And one thing we did was we defined what crafts are, because people will, in the West, particularly in the West, seem to think crafts as something less than art. This is changing, but we wanted to separate something your grandkids make in summer camp with something which is from a great art form. So we divide into 4 craft genres. We have the master artist crafts, one-of-a-kind pieces, or limited editions. We came up with the master artisan craft. These were the same techniques that are passed on generation to generation, hundreds of years, but they're made in more of an economy of scale. You make more pieces for more people, so the price comes down. You're not reinventing a new design every few months. It's the same design over and over again. And then we have the craft genre, which is found everywhere in the world. It's not dependent on centuries of expertise being handed down, but they're good. They're solid. it's good quality, and you don't have to be a 10-year apprentice to be able to make these. You can, in a couple of years, you can learn to be a decent furniture maker, to make this level of craftsmanship. And then there are hobbies. The hobby crafts are wonderful things that our neighbors make, we make, and they all deserve to be recognized and honored. We've chose master artisan crafts to focus our attention on, because that's where the big decline in numbers is. Master artist crafts have galleries, and they seem to be doing okay, but we focus on the second one. And we have a research program. We have a school where we teach working carpenters how to do joinery. It's a kind of a lost art in Japan. We teach young plasterers how to build mud and bamboo walls. These classes are free of charge. We had a class where we trained young gardeners in advanced garden techniques, which they're not learning as much as they used to. We have an apprentice program. We support 10 master dyers in the silk dyeing world. They're in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. Each one has techniques that no one else knows, and there was no one to take over their practice. Now we have 4 journeyman dyers who we pay their living expenses so they can study with these masters full time. We have a social media program where we are focusing on crafts, exposing the world to the mastery of Japanese crafts. We have monthly Zoom seminars on various subjects. We have a contest every year where we choose up to 10 young, not necessarily young, but 10 craftspeople who have guts and talent and design ability and a great idea to revitalize a craft. And we do everything we can to support and promote them. We now have 30 people in this group. And we do everything we can, not only to support them, but to allow them to support each other. So we are JapanCraft21. We would love for you to be part of our organization in any way, to be a working part of an active craft community, not just watching from the outside, but actually part of this, part of what we're doing. So you can join us on our website. It's very easy to become a member, very low bar. And thank you for your participation.
Thank you, Steve. That was a fascinating presentation. And you know, I love Japanese gardens, and I was delighted to see all the different ones you looked at. Now I've got a few more to go visit the next time I'm in Kyoto. So thank you for introducing us and giving us some background in you know, how these gardens are designed and all the different elements we should be looking at when we visit them. We're going to enter the Q&A portion of the program right now, and I'm going to start off asking Steve a few questions. But if some of you who are on the call would like to pose some questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of you as possible, and you know, take advantage of Steve's time with us today. So I met Steve a couple of years ago in Kyoto, and he was introduced as this person who was an expert in many kind of traditional Japanese crafts, although I think he will say he's an enthusiast, not necessarily an expert. But your knowledge and information that you have about how these traditions have developed over centuries and share with us is really wonderful. And thank you for all the work that you're doing with JapanCraft21. So we're delighted to have you as our featured speaker today. So I wanted to ask, you know, a lot of the gardens that you profiled in your presentation, you know, date back hundreds of years, sometimes, you know, almost as far as 1,000 years ago. Are they, you know, are what we're seeing today similar to what they were, you know, back in the Heian period and, you know, hundreds of years ago, or have they evolved over time, or how much are these kind of living, you know, changing examples of a Japanese craft, and how much of it is really static?
Great question. As I mentioned, the stones in a garden are the skeleton, the structure, and those pretty much don't change for the most part. But the plants will grow, and they'll get big, and they need to be trimmed, and they need to be managed by a master gardener. So they will change over time. They'll die and they'll be replaced. So we do see changes. There are drawings still available of many of the extent gardens. And basically, I think that the actual structure is pretty much the way it was. Even the way gravel is raked, it seems to be pretty consistent. There are exceptions where someone will come and revitalize a garden. They will change the way that the garden is raked, the pattern of the gravel. But you know, if you have a famous garden made by a famous designer, you're probably not going to change much. It's probably you're not going to change much, I would say. It's like adding a couple of butterflies to a Picasso. I mean, no one's going to do that.
So that kind of raises for me a question. You know, I'm familiar with apprenticeship programs for, you know, ceramics or weaving or carpentry or those kinds of things. Who is the who is the master craftsman in a Japanese garden? Is it the designer, or is it the caretaker, or how are those traditions carried on over years? How are people trained in the techniques they need to, you know, kind of trim the, you know, the vegetation, or lay out the design, or rake the gravel? How does that tradition carry on over not just years but centuries?
Well, unlike the West, for the most part in the West, we'll have a garden designer, and then we'll have a landscape contractor. And sometimes it's the same, but most of the time there'll be a designer, and who will make the design on paper, and we'll have someone build it. Whereas in Japan, everything happens in one house. You have the garden company, and they are garden builders, they're garden maintainers, and they do everything in these traditional companies. And so you have within that structure, you'll have the master, and you'll have apprentices, and you'll have journeymen, just as you do in many forms. And people will be hired, and they will start doing manual work initially, and over time they gain their techniques through doing. Now there's something very important that it's not, I think it's often overlooked when we speak about Japanese apprenticeship, Japanese craftsmanship. Japanese generally do not, quote unquote, teach anything. A master will not teach. It's mostly you learn by doing. You watch the master and you emulate. And the master, of course, will give some direction, but it's not teaching as we know it in the West. And consequently, it takes much longer to learn, because there's a lot of trial and error. It takes much longer to learn, and but the benefit of doing lots of trial and error is you gain abilities that you would never have if you were just taught to do one thing at a time. So the garden apprenticeships involve they would begin with manual tasks. They would begin with simple trimming, and then doing lots of trimming. And then if there's a garden to be built, the garden assistants, the apprentices, the journeymen, they're actually the arms of the garden master. So the master said, well, turn the rock this way, turn it this way, move it over here, move it over, just slide to the right. And they're just doing this. They're kind of a blank sponge, and they just take whatever the master says, they do that. And so they learn how to do that, and they build an intuitive knowledge. It's not based on anything, it's not based on theory. It's based on what they actually do with their hands over time, over years and years. 10 years would be a typical apprenticeship.
Mm-hmm. And so are there, we see some of these famous gardens, in temples and different places in Kyoto and other places.
Yeah.
But what is the state of garden design today in Japan? How are these things being reflected in, contemporary settings, environments, those kinds of things?
Well, we have those traditional garden companies, which I just described, and they are building some gardens. To commission a garden, at the extent, or let's say the level of some of those in Kyoto, that would be a very expensive proposition. You know, very involved proposition, but it is being done, and there are some garden masters. Shumio Masuno is a famous garden designer. He's a Zen priest. There's a man named Kitayama at Kodaiji, and he's internationally known. He designs gardens. So yes, they are being designed, less and less than before. But remember these famous gardens of Kyoto. These were patrons paid for these many hundreds of years ago, and so we're waiting for some new patrons. But it does exist, and there's of course modern landscaping, which has kind of a Western influence as well, which is we see quite a bit, and a combination of the two.
Great. Well, I see we actually have a lot of questions from the audience. So rather than have me just chat with you, I'd love to engage with some of the folks who are, participating in our program today. And so I wanted to see if we can include some of those. But we're going to kind of tee up a couple of questions and get people ready to kind of come on the camera when they have a chance. And then when they do, they can ask their question of you. But before we do that, let me just ask, one thing, Japanese gardens, are not only in Japan, but they're in a lot of different places. How has, Japanese gardening technique kind of spread across other countries and places?
Well, I think there are 250 Japanese gardens, public gardens in the US, which is an astounding number. I think most of them were designed by Japanese who actually went to the West and built the gardens, the majority of them. And we have the examples such as the Japanese Garden of Portland, which is a spectacular garden. It's considered, I think, the largest and the best Japanese garden in the world outside of Japan. And that was originally built by Japanese, but it's being maintained now by non-Japanese, and Japanese and non-Japanese. So it's the expertise is really spreading, and people are learning these techniques, which the techniques are really universal. The Japanese may have invented them, but these are universal techniques.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Portland Japan Garden. Miho and I both had a chance to visit that a couple of weeks ago for the annual conference of the National Association of Japan America Societies, and they hosted a lovely reception for us at the garden. I was so inspired, I became a member myself, and we actually had a program with the director of the Portland Japan Garden last year, Steve Bloom. We have a videotape of that in our YouTube channel, so if people are interested in seeing that, it's a wonderful, very engaging, really interesting story about the Portland Japan Garden. So I'd encourage you to check that out. Let's go to Tom Loudermilk. Are you available, and can you ask your question of Steve?
Steve, thank you so much for this presentation. It was absolutely splendid, really exciting. It's funny that you mentioned Tenryu-ji because I was there last summer and it was deathly hot, and it's tough when that sun strikes a lot of the sand. But anyway, I gained a deeper appreciation of the garden through your presentation just now. So, but I was wondering, a lot of these gardens were laid out, as was stated before, by patrons. I mean, the really rich long ago. But then during Meiji era and later on, do you see any other sorts of styles or innovations that get created or promoted?
Yes, Meiji was quite an eye-opener for the Japanese garden. We have the very famous Ogawa Jihei, who in the early Meiji and during the Meiji period, post 1868, let's say the 1800s, early 1900s, he created Japanese gardens, but he introduced, for example, Western style lawns, turf, which just changed, which really it was like a breath of fresh air. People had never really thought about having a green lawn in a Japanese garden. He designed many of the gardens in the around Nanzenji in Kyoto, in that district. And these were gardens for mostly for wealthy industrialists, but it's many of those gardens are open to the public at least part of the year now.
Great. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Let's go next to Michelle Peters. She asks, with all the, tourist interest in Japanese gardens, do you find that is actually supporting gardens, or is it threatening some of these gardens to, kind of with all the attention that they're getting and traffic that they're getting from hordes of tourists that go to check them out?
Thank you. I'm actually glad you asked that question. I live here in Kyoto, and I see hordes of tourists for sure. It's actually Steve Pollock and I were talking about this very recently, but it's if you have a good guidebook, you'll see amazing gardens that have almost no people in them at all. Steve was telling me he went to Fushimi Inari, and it was wall to wall people, but he went up the street to Tofukuji, which is one of the great garden, has some of the greatest gardens in the world, and there's hardly anyone there. And that's pretty much what I find. There are a few crowded places, so you want to avoid everything that TikTok says is a must see. Just avoid that. And there are dozens and dozens of great gardens. Tenryu-ji is one exception. It gets pretty crowded, and of course the Gold Pavilion and Ryoanji have always been crowded. But there are other gardens which spectacular gardens where you'll never see anyone. So I'd say that at least unless what I'm saying now goes completely viral, I don't think there's too much worry about that in the future.
Yeah, I would echo Steve's. We had a conversation how they're just Fushimi Inari, for many of you may be familiar, is the red torii gates, hundreds if not thousands of them. It's one of the iconic places to visit in Kyoto, and literally, I mean, within a 5-minute walk of that very overcrowded shrine, you can go to beautiful gardens and temples that have almost no visitors. And even at Fushimi, if you get a little bit away from kind of the main area where you enter the shrine, you can walk up the mountain, a mile or two, and it gets pretty sparse as well. Here's another question about Chinese gardens. So we have a question, why are Chinese gardens not as famous as Japanese gardens, even though the Japanese garden concept originally came from China?
The Chinese garden, first of all, the Japanese garden tradition as we know it goes back to the 600s and 700s. So it's a concept which has developed over time, and it's really become Japanicized. The Japanese garden is definitely the Japanese garden. The Chinese garden is what we see. What wasn't destroyed by the Cultural Revolution is mostly a Qing Dynasty garden, which is probably from the late 1600, around the year 1700. So it's a very short history. That said, you have the same concepts, but there are, I led garden tours in China for years, and there's so few places to go. I mean, for a garden tour, we basically, every possible thing that resembled the Chinese garden, we would have to put in our tour. Whereas in Japan, it's always a process of elimination. There's so many gardens that we don't know which one to go to first. So there aren't a lot of Chinese gardens left. Chinese gardens are spectacular. And for many years, I gave a presentation called Chinese and Japanese Gardens, One Concept, Two Interpretations. So you'll see many of the things we were talking about now, but how would the Chinese do it? How did Chinese do framing? How did they do stone placement? How did they do stepping stones? And so I think Japan just has such a body of extant work, and they're still being built to this day, that there's very little, it's very difficult to compete with that.
I see a question from Grace. Grace Toy, are you available to ask your question of Steve?
Hi. So I just wanted to ask how many of these gardens are open to the public?
Everything, I think, everything I showed today, except for maybe one garden, is open to the public. So there,
Oh, wow!
every,
thank you so much.
there's a book called The Guide to the Gardens of Kyoto by Ron Herman and Mark Tribe, and it's there's the book. It's written about 50 years ago, and when I started doing garden tours of Kyoto in 1992, that was the first book that I read. And of course, that doesn't have all the information you need to lead a garden tour, but it has a lot of information to do your own garden tour. So in that garden book, you will find about 25 or 30 open to the public gardens, and each one is different and each one is worth visiting.
Thank you. I really appreciate your talks.
Thank you.
Great. There are a few questions in here also about JapanCraft21. So I think it's good to ask that. Soraya Umewaka, are you still
Yes,
on
thank you very
the
much,
call?
Steve.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about which activities from JapanCraft21 are the most popular and why you think that's the case.
Well, they're all quite different, and I don't know how I can compare them. Our biggest effort, our biggest project is our contest, and that's the one that receives the most, let's say, notoriety. And so in the contest, we're actively choosing people who have the guts and the vision to actually do something really splendid and wonderful to revitalize a craft. So we have hundreds we've had over 300 applicants. We've chosen from there, we've chosen 30. And all the applicants, they were self-selecting, so they're all really kind of gung-ho to begin with. But we chose these 30 people, and they all have these great ideas. And so we have a lot of let's say we're very impressed by these people, and we want to, when you have people who are already on the way to success and you support those people, there's a great energy that builds. And so we do our best to support them, to support each other, and lots of programs. And so I think that's the one that's it reaches all the different genres. We have people that in weaving, in dyeing, in kumihimo silk cord making, in different kinds of furniture making, in urushi lacquerware, ceramics. So we have many genres.
Yeah, and I'm excited to say that we plan to have Steve come back for future presentations. We got such an enthusiastic response to the ceramics program that he did, and he has a number of other programs and areas of expertise that he is presenting about. So we hope to have future programs down the road. Lauren Shannon also had a question about JapanCraft21. Lauren, are you available to ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much, Steve. And Steve, and thanks for the wonderful presentation. I think you touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if JapanCraft21 has any thoughts about supporting the other end of the equation, which is, you can do these seminars and there's programs where we can get online, but having people in Japan who are more knowledgeable as guides and people in the tourism industry that can explain to both domestic and inbound travelers the deep meaning and appreciation behind some of these traditional crafts. I'm a big proponent of education, and I feel like some of the lack of appreciation or the lack of joining into these professions is just a lack of knowledge and a connection to history. And I think guides can be a really powerful piece of that. In general, I feel like Japan invests more in the end result program and less in the education to bring people to understanding. And I wonder if JapanCraft21 has thought about investing in also teaching guides about the depth of your knowledge and the depth of the artisans.
You're beautiful, fantastic. Can I quote you?
Sure.
No, we are absolutely on that page. We've done several seminars for guides, and we actually created a video for guide training. And I have a new there's a new guide a guide management company which approached us, and we're going to be doing something for them. It's very important, and it's you know, when you figure there are something like 30 million people coming to Japan every year, and no one knows about the crafts. They don't know where to buy them. They don't know where to see them. So we would like to move in that direction. If you're involved, you're living in Japan, you said?
Yeah, I run a travel company here, and we would love to be more involved with your program.
Come contact us. We would love to work with your guides. Absolutely. And we don't charge for this. This is and I have a video I can loan you right away. You know,
that's great. I think this is, I'm so happy because I think a group like yours can be such a bridge to this, because like the prefectural and municipal governments, they create a great destination or project, but no one can take our guests there. And so I think this is really powerful. So thank you, Steve. I will leave room for other people, but let's connect offline.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I think there are a lot of people who either have passion for gardening or Japanese gardens themselves. Nancy Buell asked a question about you know, being able to observe them. Do you want to ask your question, Nancy, if you're still on the call? Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I've been trained somewhat as an aesthetic pruner here in the Bay Area, and I'm especially interested in observing pruners in Japan. And I'm wondering if that's possible.
Are you in the
likely time of day that I might run into them? And
were you in the Merit College program?
yes, yes.
Oh, fantastic program. Fantastic. That's a good question. You know, that it's not difficult to find if you're here at certain times of year in the fall, or June, or in the fall. You can, the trimming is going on in public gardens all the time during those periods of time. So you could just you can pay a few dollars to get in, and you can stand there you can stand there the whole day and watch. There's no restriction. So there's nothing that I know that is organized for that, but it's not difficult to find.
Great, thanks.
Great. And, you know, another question that's come up from several people is, you know, I don't know if you have particular gardens or people on the, you know, chat know of gardens in the Bay Area, but there are so many gardens, Japanese inspired gardens, Japanese gardens in different places. How can we go about finding places to visit, you know, outside of Japan?
Well, there's an organization of Japanese gardens in North America, North American Japanese Garden Association, I think it's called. And I think you can get that information through the Portland Garden has that information. I think that they are assisting that organization. So there is a list.
Yeah, I think that was started actually by the Portland Japan Garden, if I'm not mistaken. But I think there's some close to, like you said, some close to 300 gardens that are listed there. So
especially in California, I think there are quite a few.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think we're going to wrap up our kind of formal Q&A portion of this program. And, you know, thanks, Steve, for his wonderful presentation. He's agreed to stay around a little bit longer for those of you who want to stick around and have a bit more of a Q&A with him. But we, you know, as we wrap up, we'll turn off the video and just have a little bit more informal session with him. I do want to mention that we plan to have more programs on Japan Crafts with Steve coming up in the future. And so keep an eye on our website and announcements for, you know, those programs coming up. Steve, anything else you want to add in wrapping up the program today?
Sure. You know, again, it's putting it together, something like this today is, it's almost like going to a buffet and just having a very tiny plate and just putting a few things on. There's so much to talk about. And at some point, I would love to do that follow-up presentation on how Japanese site designs, Japanese gardens, Japanese architecture inspires mindfulness. And I go through all the techniques, everything from the way things are placed, the juxtapositions of things, the transitions, to the way lighting changes during the day, use of washi for windows. I mean, there's so many things. Japan is really a center for site design to bring about mindfulness. And that's why we all feel so good when we walk through these sites. We may not know why we're feeling so good, but it's because we're mindful, we're paying attention. We kind of wakes us up. So I'd like to do that someday.
Great. Well, thanks, Steve. And just a final plug, in addition to our program on Japanese gardens, Japan Society of Northern California does many other programs, more than 70 last year, and we're on about the same pace this year. Some things that we have coming up are our annual gala, which is coming up on September 27th. And if you want a fun evening, that is our biggest fundraiser of the year in support of the Japan Society. We would love to have you join us. It's a chance to meet with a large group of people who support the Japan Society, as well as building stronger relations between the US and Japan. We have some excellent awardees this year, as Dewan mentioned, Peanuts and Snoopy, as well as Koichi Nakamura, a prominent venture capitalist here in the Bay Area. And it should be, and we have a live performance by David Benoit, a well-known jazz musician who also has been affiliated with Peanuts for many years. So it should be a very fun program on September 27th. And we have more programs coming up. We have actually a program on Nippon Kobo coming up this weekend, which includes more music and performance in San Francisco that we are helping to organize and promote. And we have other programs coming up. A big program in Japan will be our annual healthcare conference, which comes up in November, the week of November 11th. And we have programs in Tokyo and Kumamoto on building a trans-Pacific ecosystem in healthcare. So our programming covers a wide range from cultural and contemporary things to business, innovation, technology, policy, and many other kinds of issues. So we hope that you will take an interest. You can also study Japanese class through Japan Society of Northern California. So with that, let me bring our formal program to a close. And thank you very much, Steve and Japan Craft. We really appreciate your excellent program and look forward to hearing more from you.